Let's talk about automating Twingate and what you can use in Twingate to automate its configuration and deployment. There's lots to cover, so let's jump in. So first, everything you're going to see in this module is built on the Twingate public API, so we need to cover that first. The Twingate public API is a GraphQL API, which is, if you're not familiar, somewhat similar to REST, a little bit more subtle, a little bit more flexible. The QL of GraphQL stands for query language, so you can do a little bit more with GraphQL than you can do with a REST API, and it's also much better in terms of performance. If you're trying to pull a lot of data, you can craft client-side queries to get only and exactly the data you need, and no less, no more. Read and write operations in the API are throttled. The documentation will give you the current limits. You can work with support if you need higher limits, that's not a problem. The authentication for the API is done via API tokens. So you can generate API tokens in the admin console of Twingate. Let's take a look at that. It's in the settings. And under API, you will be able to generate a token with different permission levels. And you can filter on inbound IP if needed, if you want to restrict it a little bit more. The API itself exposes the majority of what can be done in the admin console. Not everything, but about 90% of what you can do in the admin UI in the console, you can do using the API. We have a lot of content actually on the API in the documentation. If you're not super familiar with GraphQL, I strongly recommend starting with this link because it'll give you a Postman collection you can download. If you don't know Postman, Postman is free and is a very convenient tool you can use to test APIs. So the file that you can download from the documentation contains many examples of using our API. And so it's a really good starting point if you don't know GraphQL too well. I also recommend, as you're working through the Postman examples, watching part 1, 2, and 3 of the videos that are here. They will walk you through the basics of GraphQL. They don't assume you know anything about GraphQL, and they're not specific to Twingate per se, technically. So it should be a good introduction to GraphQL. You have a couple of videos that are bonus content that we'll talk about in a minute. And this is the official documentation of the scope of the API. There's a little bit more than this, but it's a very quick introduction to some queries as well that is available here. It talks about the schema. So let's talk about the schema as well. You can, because it's GraphQL, it's typically self-documented. So my recommendation for GraphQL is that you go and download something called Altair. Let me see. Altair GraphQL client. It's free. And all you'll need to do once you have it deployed is open it. There it is. You'll go and specify a header, which will be your API token for your own tenant. So I'm using TwinDemo in this case. And all you need to do is just refresh this. This will load the documentation from the GraphQL API endpoints. And long story short, in GraphQL, there's queries and mutations. Queries are to retrieve data. It's a read query, typically. And a mutation is an update. It's something you're creating, deleting. It's any change that you're enacting with the API. So all you need to do is just click on queries to take a look at all of the types of data you can pull from the API. And if you want to take a look at the actions you can implement, they're going to be under mutations. Again, all of this is covered in the API intro in the documentation. So I highly recommend taking a look at Altair, but also the documentation link for the API. It is your best chance at getting introduced to the API from a very practical standpoint. Now, Apart from the documentation, Twingate provides two command line interfaces, one that is built based on JavaScript and the other one based on Python. Both of those CLIs are open source. You can download the source code, you can change the source code, adapt it to your own use case. You can submit issues, you can submit push requests if you have suggestions for improvements for the command line interfaces. They're both wrapped around the GraphQL public API. So typically, if it's possible in the API, it should be possible in the CLI. It's not always the case. The CLI gets implemented after API endpoints become available, so there's a little bit of a lag sometimes. But if something's missing, you can always open an issue so we can take a look at it. And the command line interfaces are basically designed to make it easier to use the API. So if you want to bulk create resources from a spreadsheet that defines all of your resources, if you want to bulk deploy connectors and retrieve their tokens, if you want to delete stuff, if you want to change names, if you want to assign policies to resources in bulk, anything you can do pretty much in the UI you can do here, like verifying devices, unverifying devices, blocking devices, archiving devices, and so on. There's a couple of things that you're not going to be able to do in the API and by extension the CLI, but it's pretty rare, and so there's very few things you cannot do. The reason there's two CLIs is just because we figured we would provide a code base in two separate languages to people, depending on what they intend to do with a CLI. They're pretty similar in terms of what they can do. The JavaScript command line interface is a little bit better if you're trying to export all of the data from your tenants. If you're trying to do a migration, for instance, maybe lean towards the JavaScript command line interface. The Python one is maybe a bit better if you're doing, if you're life-changing stuff. But you can take a look at the documentation for both. Like I said, it's in the documentation itself with a lot of examples and introductions to it. And you can also go and review the source code to see how it's built and adapt it to your own use case. That is not a problem. And remember that because the CLI is built on the API, the CLI is by default also throttled, although that shouldn't be much of an issue, but it is the case. Now, beyond CLIs that you still need to deploy and you need to run, you can use Terraform or Pulumi, right? So we provide a native Terraform provider that also wraps around the GraphQL API. If you have an issue with the Terraform provider, or if you have a suggestion for it, it's actually open to all, but you should be able to open an issue here, and our team will look at it and implement it if something is missing. You have some introductory guides in the documentation as well. You can access the source code of the provider. And you have also available this is the documentation on the Terraform side. And on top of all of this, there are examples that you can pull from that we put together for AWS, Azure, and GCP in case you're interested in taking a look at that. It goes in detail, right? So for AWS, for instance, it covers EC2, ECS, and EKS. I don't know that they're all the same level of thoroughness, and some of them are yet to be built, but there's a lot of examples of things you can do with Terraform in Twingate. Now, finally, there's another provider that you can use for infrastructure as code. Oh, by the way, because the Terraform provider is built on top of the API, it's the same thing as the command line interface. If something comes out that is net new to the API, it takes a little bit of time, a couple of weeks, few weeks, to make an appearance into the Terraform provider because it is also built on top of the API. So just keep that in mind. And the same is true for Pulumi. Pulumi is just another infrastructure as code platform. And Pulumi is also based on the API. Same kind of deal here. If you have an issue with it, you can open an issue on the GitHub repository for the Pulumi provider on the Twingate side. There's a lot of introductory guides on Pulumi in the documentation across GCP, AWS, and Azure. This is a link to the Pulumi documentation. That is the official documentation and with examples documented on the Pulumi site. And then you also have access to the Pulumi provider source code if you want to take a look and use it for some reason. That is not a problem. Now, that's it for automation.